The Great Train Robbery was a robbery of 2.61 million, equivalent to 58 million present day, from a Royal Mail train heading from Glasgow to London on the West Coast Main Line in the early hours of the 8th of August 1963 at Bridgeo Railway Bridge, Ledburn, near Mentormore in Buckinghamshire, England. After tampering with the line sign signals to bring the train to a halt, a gang of 15, led by Bruce Reynolds, attacked the train. Other gang members included Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards, Charlie Wilson, Roy James, John Daly, Jimmy White, Ronnie Biggs, Tommy Wisby, Jim Hussey, Bob Welsh, and Roger Caudry, as well as 3 men known only as numbers 1, 2 and 3. 2 were later identified as Harry Smith and Danny Pembroke. A 16th man, an unnamed retired train driver, was also present. With careful planning based on inside information from the individual known as the Ulsterman, whose real identity has never been established. The bulk of the stolen money has never been recovered. They did not use any firearms, though Jack Mills, the train driver, was beaten over the head with a metal bar and suffered serious head injuries. After partial recovery, Mills returned to work doing light duties. He retired in 1967 and passed away in 1970 due to an unrelated illness. Mills never overcame the trauma of the robbery. After the robbery, they hid at Leatherslade Farm. The police found this hideout, and incriminating evidence, a monopoly board with fingerprints, led to the eventual arrest and conviction of most of the gang. The ringleaders were sentenced to 30 years in prison. The plan to intercept and rob the overnight Glasgow to London mail train was based on information from an unnamed senior security officer within Royal Mail, who had detailed knowledge of the amounts of money carried. He was introduced to 2 of the criminals who would carry out the raid, Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards, by a London solicitor's clerk, Brian Field. The raid was devised over a period of months by Goody and Edwards, along with Bruce Reynolds and Charlie Wilson, with Reynolds assuming the role of mastermind. This gang, although very successful in the criminal underworld, had virtually no experience in stopping and robbing trains, so it was agreed to enlist the help of other London gang called the South Coast Raiders. The group included Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch and Jim Hussey, who were already accomplished train robbers. This group also included Roger Caudry, a man who was a specialist in this field and knew how to rig the trackside signals to stop them. Other associates, including Ronnie Briggs, who Reynolds had previously met in jail, were added as the organisation evolved. The final gang who took part in the raid comprised of a total of 16 men. At 6:50 p.m. on Wednesday the 7th of August 1963, the travelling post office, up special train, set off from Glasgow Central Station en route to Euston Station in London. It was scheduled to arrive at Euston at 4 a.m. the following morning. The train consisted of 12 carriages and carried 72 post office staff, who sorted mail during the journey. Mail was loaded on the train at Glasgow, during additional station stops en route, and from line-side collection points where local post office staff would hang mail sacks on elevated trackside hooks that were caught by nets deployed by the onboard staff. Sorted mail on the train could be dropped off at the same time. This process of exchange allowed mail to be distributed locally without delaying the train with unnecessary stops. One of the carriages involved in the robbery is preserved at the Nene Valley Railway. The second carriage behind the engine was known as the HVP coach, which carried large amounts of money and registered mail for sorting. Usually the value of the shipment was in the region of £300,000, but because the previous weekend had been a UK bank holiday weekend, the total on the day of the robbery was to be between 2.5 and 3 million. In 1960, the Post Office Investigation Branch recommended the fitting of alarms to all TPOs with HVP carriages. The recommendation was implemented in 1961, but HVP carriages without alarms were retained in reserve. By August 1963, 3 HVP carriages were equipped with alarms, bars over the windows and bolts and catches on the doors. But at the time of the robbery, these carriages were out of service, so a reserve carriage without those features had to be used. The fitting of radios was also considered, but they were deemed to be too expensive, and the measure was not implemented. This carriage was kept for evidence for 7 years following the event, and then burned in a scrapyard in Norfolk, in the presence of police and post office officials to deter any souvenir hunters. The robbers tampered with a signal light on the West Coast Main Line at Sears Crossing, Ledburn, between Leighton Buzzard and Cheddington, covering the green light with a glove and using a battery to power the red light. Just after 3 a.m. on the 8th of August, the driver, 58-year-old Jack Mills from Crewe, stopped the train at the signal. As the signal stop was unexpected at this time and place, the train's second crew member, 26-year-old David Whitby, also from Crewe, climbed down from the cab to call the signalman from a line-side telephone, only to find the cables had been cut. As he returned to the train, he was overpowered by one of the robbers. Meanwhile, the members entered the engine cabin from both sides. As Mills grappled with one robber, he was struck from behind by another and rendered semi-conscious. The robbers now had to move the train to Mentmore Bridge, approximately 800 metres further along the track, where they planned to unload the money. One of the robbers had spent months befriending railway staff and familiarising himself with the layout and operation of trains and carriages. Ultimately, though, it was decided that it would be better to use an experienced train driver to move the train. On that night, the gang's hired train driver, Stanagate, or Pete, was unable to operate this newer type of train, although having driven trains for many years. He was by then retired and was experienced only on shunting trains in the southern region. With no alternative available to them, it was quickly decided that Mills would have to move the train to the stopping point near the bridge, which was indicated by a white sheet stretched between poles on the track. Biggs' only task was to supervise Agate's participation in the robbery, and when it became obvious that Agate was not able to drive the train, he and Biggs were sent to the waiting truck to help load the mailbags. The train was stopped at Bridge Bridge, and the robbers' assault force attacked the HVP carriage. Frank Dewhurst was in charge of the other postal workers, Leslie Penn, Joseph Ware and John O'Connor in the HVP carriage. Thomas Kett, assistant inspector in charge of the train from the Carlisle to Euston, was also in charge. Dewhurst and Kett were hit when they made an attempt to stop the robbers. Once the robbers had entered the carriage, the staff could put up no effective resistance as there was no police officer or security guard on board. The staff were made to lie face down on the floor in the corner of the carriage. Mills and Whitby were then brought into the carriage, handcuffed together and put with the staff. Because a 30-minute limit had been set by Reynolds, the robbers removed all but 8 of the 128 sacks from the HVP carriage, which they transferred in under 20 minutes to the waiting truck. They departed in their Austin Lodestar truck around 30 minutes after the robbery began, and, in an effort to mislead any potential witnesses, they used 2 Land Rovers, both with a registration plate BMG 757A. They then headed along minor roads, listening for police broadcasts on a VHF radio, and arrived back at Leatherslade Farm at around 4:30. Leatherslade was a rundown farm between Oakley and Brill. It had been bought 2 months earlier as the hideout. At the farm, they counted the money and divided it into 16 full shares and several smaller shares. The full shares apparently came to approximately £150,000 each. From listening to their police-tuned radio, they learned that the police calculated that they had gone within a 30-mile radius of the crime. This declaration was based on the information given by a witness at the crime scene who stated that a gang member had told the post office workers not to move for half an hour. The press interpreted this information as a 30-mile radius as a half-an-hour drive in a fast car. The vehicles that they had driven to the farm could no longer be used as they had been seen by the train staff. Brian Field came to the farm on Thursday to pick up his share and to take Roy James to London to find an extra vehicle. Bruce Reynolds and John Daly picked up cars. Field, his wife Catherine and Mark brought the vans and drove the remainder of them to the Field home to recover. Field had arranged with Mark to carry out a comprehensive clean-up and set fire to the farm after the robbers had left, even though the robbers had already spent much time wiping the place down to be free of fingerprints. According to Buster Edwards, he nicked £10,000 to help pay Mark. On Monday, when Charlie Wilson rang Brian Field to check whether the farm had been cleared, he did not believe Field. He called a meeting with Edwards, Reynolds, Daly and James, and they agreed that they needed to be sure. They called Field to a meeting on Tuesday, where he was forced to admit that he failed to torch the farm. In an IVS 2012 documentary film, the Great Train Robbery, Bruce Reynolds' son, Nick Reynolds, said, "The guy who was paid to basically go back to the farm and burn it down did a runner." The robbers had cut all the telephone lines in the vicinity, but one of the railmen left on the train at Sears Crossing caught a passing goods train at Cheddington, where he raised the alarm at around 4:20 a.m. The first reports of the robbery were broadcast on a VHF police radio within a few minutes, and this is what they were heard on the line. "A robbery has been committed and you'll never believe it. They've stolen the train." Bruce Richard Reynolds was born on the 7th of September 1931 at Charing Cross Hospital, Strand, London, to Thomas Richard and Dorothy Margaret. His mother passed in 1935, and he had trouble living with his father and stepmother, so he often stayed with one of his grandmothers. Reynolds was jailed for 3 years on several counts of breaking and entering, and upon his release quickly started reoffending. He soon joined a gang with his best friend John Daly. They were mentored by Ernie Watts and Terry Hogan. He did some work with Jimmy White and met Buster Edwards at Charlie Richardson Club. Richardson in return introduced him to Gordon Goody. After the train heist, Reynolds escaped to Mexico with his wife, Angela, and young son Nick Reynolds, and lived lavishly with his share of the take. When the money ran out, Reynolds moved his family to Canada and then France under false identities in search of work before returning to the UK to pursue opportunities promised by old criminal contacts. He was arrested in 1968 in Torquay and sentenced to 25 years in jail. He was released a decade later. Reynolds was sent back to prison in the mid-1980s for dealing amphetamines. He produced occasional journalism pieces, was a consultant on a movie and book projects about the train heist, and published a well-regarded crime memoir, Crossing the Line, the Autobiography of a Thief, in 1995. In a 2003 interview, Reynolds recalled, "From an early age, I always wanted a life of adventure." He was rejected by the Royal Navy because of his poor eyesight, and then tried to become a foreign correspondent, but his highest achievement was a clerk at Daily Mail. While his life in crime did not provide excitement, Reynolds said in 2003, "I've always felt that I can't escape my past, and in many ways, I feel like there is a line from ancient mariner and that the notoriety has been like an albatross around my neck." Reynolds passed away at age 81 on the 28th of February 2013 after a brief illness. Of Northern Irish descent, Douglas Gordon Goody was born in Putney, London in March 1930 and was still living there in his mother's flat at the time of the robbery. In the early 1960s, he joined Buster Edwards' gang and helped rob various targets. Sentenced to 30 years for his role in the crime, he was released from prison in 1975. Goody then moved to Spain, where he ran a beachfront bar. In a September 2015 interview, Goody claimed the identity of the Ulsterman was Patrick McKenna, a postal employee. The interview was shown in a documentary marking the 50th anniversary of the robbery called The Great Train Robbery, A Tale of Two Thieves. The documentary makers employed social worker Ariel Bruce, who finds missing family members to trace McKenna. Discovered after obtaining records through the Freedom of Information Act, McKenna had passed away some years previously. However, Bruce made contact with McKenna's family and obtained copies of photographs, which Goody confirmed to be the same person that he had met 50 years earlier. The documentary suggests that McKenna never benefited from the money, but instead gave it to the Catholic Church. It suggests that McKenna was motivated by the failure of the post office to provide better security for the night train staff, and he hoped that the robbery would be a wake-up call. Goody passed away of emphysema on the 29th of January 2016 at the age of 85. The most dangerous was the silent man Charlie Wilson. He was born on the 30th of June 1932 to Bill and Mabel Wilson in Battersea. His friends from childhood were Jimmy Hussey, Tommy Whitby, Bruce Reynolds and Gordon Goody. Later on he met Ronald Buster Edwards and the young driving enthusiast Mickey Ball and Roy James, who had taken up car theft. From 1948 to 1950, he was called up for national service, and in 1955 he married Patricia Osborne, with whom he had 3 children. He turned to crime early in life. While he did have legitimate work in his in-law's grocer shop, he was also a thief, and his criminal proceeds were into buying shares in various gambling enterprises. He went to jail for short spells for numerous offences. In 1960, he began to work with Bruce Reynolds and planned to get into the criminal big league. Ronald Christopher Edwards was born on the 27th of January 1932 at Lambeth, London. After leaving school, he worked in a sausage factory, where he began his criminal career by stealing meat to sell on the post-war black market. During his national service in the RAF, he was detained for stealing cigarettes. When he returned to South London, he ran a drinking club and became a professional criminal. He married June Rose in 1952. They had a daughter, Nikki. In his final years, he ran a flower stall outside Waterloo Station in London. Brian Arthur Field was born on the 15th of December 1934. He served 2 years in the Royal Army Service Corps, seeing service during the Korean War. Although soldiers in the Service Corps were considered combat personnel, they were primarily associated with transport and logistics. He was discharged from the military. It was with a very good character. Field later became a solicitor's managing clerk for John Wheater & Co. Although he was only 28 at the time of the robbery, he was already apparently more prosperous than his boss, John Wheater. Field drove a new Jaguar and had a house with his wife at the Birdle Path, Whitchurch Hill, Oxfordshire, while his boss owned a battered Ford and lived in a rundown neighbourhood. Part of the reason for Field's prosperity was that he was not adverse to giving Goody and Edwards information about his clients and what they had in their country houses, making them prime targets for the thieves. On one occasion, he described the contents and layout of a house near Weybridge where his wife Corinne had once been a nanny. Prior to the robbery, Field had represented Buster Edwards and Gordon Goody. He had arranged Edwards' defence when he had been caught with a stolen car and had met Goody at a nightclub in Soho. Field was called upon to assist in Goody's defence in the aftermath of the airport job, which was a robbery carried out on the 27th of November 1962 at BOAC Comet House, Hatton Cross, London Airport. This was the big practice robbery that the South West Gang had done before the Great Train robbery. Field was successful in arranging bail for Goody and Charlie Wilson. In 2014, Douglas Goody claimed to journalists that the Ulsterman was Patrick McKenna, at the time of the robbery, a 43-year-old postal worker living in Salford, Lancashire. McKenna, who was originally from Belfast, met Goody 4 times in 1963. Goody alleged that he found out McKenna's name only when he saw it written inside his glasses case. It is not known what became of the share that McKenna allegedly received, but his children were flabbergasted on hearing the claim of their father's involvement. It was summarised that McKenna either donated his share to the Catholic Church over the years or had had his money stolen from him. This alleged identification of McKenna as the Ulsterman has been disputed, not least because McKenna appears to have no criminal record or associations and passed away poor. It's been suggested that a known associate of the convicted robbers, Sammy Osterman, was a part of the gang, and his Ulsterman nickname was simply the result of mishearing his surname. At 5 o'clock, Chief Superintendent Malcolm Futrell heard of the Buckinghamshire Police CID, located at Aylesbury, arrived at the crime scene where he supervised evidence gathering. He was then sent to Cheddington Railway Station, where the train had been taken and where statements were taken from the driver and postal workers. It appeared from interviews with the witnesses that about 15 hooded men dressed in blue boiler suits had been involved, but little could be gleaned. By lunchtime of the following day, it became obvious to Futrell that extra resources were needed to cope with the scale of the investigation. The Buckinghamshire Chief Constable referred the case to Scotland Yard. George Hatherill, commander of the Sea Department, and Detective Chief Superintendent Ernest Ernie Millen, head of the flying squad, were initially in charge of the London side of the investigation. They sent Detective Superintendent Gerald MacArthur and Detective Sergeant John Pritchard to assist the Buckinghamshire Police. The police then undertook a major search, fanning out from the crime scene after having failed to find any forensic evidence there. A watch was put on all seaports. The Postmaster General Reginald Bevins offered a £10,000 reward to the first person giving information leading to the apprehension and conviction of the persons responsible for the robbery. Following a tip-off from a herdsman who used a field adjacent to Leatherslade Farm, a police sergeant and constable, called there on the 13th of August 1963. The farm was deserted, but they found the truck used by the robbers, which had been hastily painted yellow, as well as the Land Rovers. They also found a large quantity of food, bedding, sleeping bags, post office sacks, registered mail packages, banknote wrappers, and a Monopoly board game. It was determined that although the farm had been cleaned for fingerprints, some finger and palm prints had been overlooked, including those on a ketchup bottle and those on the Monopoly set which had been used after the robbery for a game, but with real money. Despite the big breakthrough of the discovery at Leatherslade Farm, the investigation was not going well. The London side of the investigation then continued under Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler. On Monday the 12th of August 1963, Butler was appointed to head of the police investigation of the London connection and quickly formed a 6-man train robbery squad. With Leatherslade Farm finally found, the train robbery squad descended on the farm. The breakthrough came when Detective Chief Superintendent Millen met a distinguished barrister in a smoking room of an exclusive West End club who told him that someone was willing to inform on the gang. The process of talking to the informer was handled by Heatherill and Millen, and they never divulged the identity of the informer to the detectives in their command. The informant had been jailed in a provincial prison just before the train robbery and was hoping to get parole and other favours from talking. He clearly did not know all the names perfectly, and a second informant, a woman, was able to fill the gaps. Millen said in his book, Specialist in Crime, "The breakthrough with the informer came at the moment when I and my colleagues at the yard were in a state of frustration almost approaching despair. The process saw them get 18 names to be passed on to detectives to match up with a list being prepared from fingerprints collected at Leatherslade. Heatherill and Millen decided to publish photos of the wanted men, despite strong protests from Tommy Butler and Frank Williams. This resulted in most of the robbers going underground. The trial of the robbers began at Aylesbury Assizes, Buckinghamshire, on the 20th of January 1964. Because it would be necessary to accommodate a large number of lawyers and journalists, the existing court was deemed too small, and so the offices of Aylesbury Rural District Council were specifically converted for this event. The defendants were brought to the court each day from Aylesbury Prison in a compartmentalised van, out of view of the large crowd of spectators. Mr. Justice Edmund Davies presided over the trial, which lasted 51 days and included 613 exhibits and 240 witnesses. The jury retired to the Grange Youth Centre in Aylesbury to consider the verdict. On the 11th of February 1964, there was a sensation when John Daly was found to have no case to answer. His counsel, Walter Rayburn QC, claimed that the evidence against his client was limited to his fingerprints being on the Monopoly set found at Leatherslade Farm and the fact that he went underground after the robbery. Rayburn went on to say that Daly had played the Monopoly game with Bruce Reynolds in 1963 and that he'd gone underground only because he was associated with people publicly sought by the police. There was no proof of involvement in the conspiracy. The judge agreed, and the jury was directed to acquit him. Detective Inspector Frank Williams was shocked when this occurred because, owing to Tommy Butler's refusal to share information, he had no knowledge of the fact that Daly's prints were only on the Monopoly set. If Williams had known this, he could have asked Daly questions about the Monopoly set and robbed him of his very effective alibi. Daly was clever in avoiding having a photo taken when he was arrested until he could shave his beard. This meant that there was no photo to show the lengths he had gone to in order to change his appearance. No actions were taken against Butler for this mistake, but in not ensuring the case against Daly was more thorough. On the 15th of April 1964, the proceedings ended with the judge describing the robbery as a crime of sordid violence inspired by vast greed, and passing sentences of 30 years imprisonment on 7 of the robbers. On the 13th of July 1964, the appeals by Lenny Field and Brian Field against the charges and conspiracy to rob were allowed. This resulted in their sentences being in effect reduced to 5 years only. On the 14th of July 1964, the appeals by Roger Caudry and Bill Bowl were allowed, with the convictions for conspiracy to rob quashed, leaving only the receiving charges. Justice Fenton Atkinson concluded that a miscarriage of justice would result if Bowles' charges were upheld. Given his age, physique and temperament made him an unlikely train robber. Luckily for him, as the oldest robber, Caudry was also deemed to be not guilty of the conspiracy because his prints had not been found at Litherslide. Brian Field was only reluctantly acquitted of the robbery. Justice Atkinson stated that he would not be surprised if Field were not only part of the conspiracy but also one of the robbers. The charges against the other men were all upheld. In the end, Lenny Field and Bill Bowl got some measure of justice, but Bowl passed away in prison in 1970. £2,631,684 was stolen, although the police report says £2,595,997. The bulk of the haul was in £1 notes and £5 notes, both the older white note and the newer blue note, which was half its size. The £5 notes were bundled in batches of £2,500, the £1 note in batches of £500. There were also 10 shilling notes in batches of £250. A quantity of Irish and Scottish money was also stolen. With a few notable exceptions, the money was quickly laundered or divided by friends, family and associates of the robbers. Much was laundered through bookmakers, although, astonishingly, only a few £100s were identifiable by serial numbers, so the robbers could have spent the money without the fear of being traced. There were 1,579 notes whose serial numbers were known, and the rest of the money was completely untraceable. The £5 notes were two different types, because in 1957 the British government had begun to replace the large white notes with smaller blue ones. The final changeover had not been completed at the time of the robbery. The white notes quickly became far more conspicuous to use, making it harder for them to be spent. Although within 6 months of the robbery, 10 of the robbers had been locked up awaiting trial, and 3 others were wanted criminals on the run. Very little of the money had actually been recovered. This led to the speculation that there is a great deal of robbery loot still out there. In fact, the money was soon seized and spent. Thus, the proceeds of the greatest cash robbery in British history were quickly used up, with few of the robbers receiving any long-term benefit. Less than £400,000 was eventually recovered. Over half of this consisted of the shares of Caudry and allegedly Brian Field. A further £36,000 was recovered from Jimmy White's van. Roy James was carrying £12,041 when captured. The final sum recovered was £47,245 that was found in a telephone box in Great Dover Street, Newington, South London. The £47,245 recovered from a telephone box included 55 notes whose serial numbers had been recorded by the bank in Scotland. This money was part of a deal struck with Frank Williams and Danny Pembroke. Piers Paul Reed in The Train Robbers claimed that the police were feeling the pressure because they had caught many of the robbers. They had failed to recover much of the money. While no evidence had been found against Pembroke, who was believed to have been one of the South Coast raiders, so the identifiable banknotes had been traced back to him through friends who had been charged with receiving. Given that the police had insufficient evidence against Pembroke, either at Leatherslade Farm or definitive connection with either of the two gangs, Butler was prepared to let him go. Williams convinced Butler to pull Pembroke in for questioning in return for releasing him and not charging his friends with more serious crimes. £50,000 was to be returned. On the 3rd of December 1963, which happened to be the same day that Roy James was taken into custody, the police received an anonymous tip directing them to the money in the phone box. The money was driven up to Aylesbury and taken into custody by Detective Superintendent Farwell. The money was driven up to Aylesbury and taken into custody by Detective Superintendent Futrell, who wondered how his London colleagues could know how much money there was. He had to bring in bank clerks to count the damp and musty money to determine the final sum. Williams made no admission to the recovery of the money being the result of a deal with Pembroke. Despite claiming that his negotiations were responsible for the return of the money, Williams, in his book, No Fixed Addresses in 1973, claimed to not know the identity of the person who had returned the money, although he did mention several robbers to whom he had offered deals through intermediaries. He noted that it seemed to him that Butler was sceptical of his efforts, and then, at the press conference, Hatherill and Millen did not reveal the circumstances behind the find, and that he was never asked to talk to them about it. Despite Pembroke being The man identified as the assailant of the train driver, Jack Mills, by Bruce Reynolds, albeit indirectly. Williams only makes mention of the assailant once in his book. In this section, he confirms that with Tommy Butler, he convinced the man they knew to be the assailant, but they had no evidence to convict him. Strangely, however, he makes no further mention of him. The deal done with Pembroke caused outrage in the police hierarchy. It is hinted in several books that the deals done by Williams were responsible for his being overlooked for promotion, and that Williams was unhappy that his efforts were not recognised by Butler, but they were instead hidden from superiors. For this part, George Hathrill, in his book A Detective's Tale, stated that the motive behind the return of the money was not known for certain. He said that the money was returned by one about who extensive inquiries had been made and who in fact was interrogated at length, but in spite of our strong suspicions, nothing could be proved against him, and so no charge could be brought. My belief is that he thought we knew more about him than we did, and thinking things were getting hot, he decided to get rid of the money to avoid being found in possession with it. Hathrill does not mention Williams at all in his book. He retired on the last day of the trial at Aylesbury. All 11 men sentenced all fell aggrieved at the sentences handed down, particularly Bill Bowl and Lenny Field, who were later found not guilty of the charges against them. The other men, aside from Wheater, resented what they considered to be the excessive length of the sentence. Train robbers who were sentenced later, and by different judges, received shorter terms. The severity of the sentences caused some surprise. When Bruce Reynolds was arrested in 1968, he allegedly told arresting officer Tommy Butler that those sentences had a detrimental effect. According to him, they had prompted criminals generally to take guns with them when they set out on robberies. The robbers who spent much time on the run overseas, Reynolds, Wilson and Edwards, had very little left when they were finally arrested, having had to spend the money avoiding capture and indulging in lavish lifestyles without finding employment. Much of Jimmy White's money was taken from him. According to Marilyn Wisby, her father's share was hidden by his father, Tommy Wisby Sr., in the panels of the doors of his home. Butler raided them 3 times but never found the train money. The majority of the money was reputedly entrusted to Wisby's father and also to his younger brother Ron, who coincidentally had saved some money of his own that was confiscated by the police and returned to Ron 3 months later. By the time Wisby was released from jail, all of his share had either been spent or invested. Marilyn agrees with Piers Paul's Reed's assessment of how her father's share of approximately £150,000 was spent. Although the Wisby share was one that was not taken by other criminals, Marilyn Wisby is still bitter that her relatives got to spend a fair amount of the loot while the overall sum dwindled away. However, her grandfather used some of the money to buy them a house in Upper Norwood. Up to 6 of the robbers escaped punishment in one way or another. The Ulstermen, 3 robbers who were never caught, John Daly, who had his charges dismissed at the trial, and Ronnie Biggs, who escaped from jail and managed to avoid being taken back to the UK. Daly had entrusted his money to another crook. This man had betrayed him to the police and had absconded with the money. He passed away before Daly could catch up with him. Upon the release of the others in the mid-1970s, Bill Jennings got in touch with Buster Edwards, and Frank Monroe got in touch with the South Coast Raiders. Both said that they had no money left. Danny Pembroke went initially to America, and John Daly, at the time, was said to be living on unemployment benefits in the west of England. Ronnie Briggs quickly spent his share getting a new life. He loved his new life in Australia, although by the time his family arrived in 1966, all but £7,000 had been spent. £55,000 had been paid as a package to deal him out of the UK. The rest had gone on legal fees and expenses. The Brink's-Mat robbery was one of the largest robberies in British history, with £26 million worth of gold, bullion, diamonds and cash stolen. It occurred at the Heathrow International Trading Estate in London on the 26th of November 1983, from a warehouse operated by Brink's-Mat, a former joint venture between US security company Brinks and London-based company Mat Transport. The bullion was the property of Johnson Matthey Bankers Limited. Mickey McAvoy and Brian Robertson were convicted of armed robbery. Most of the gold has never been recovered. Lloyd's of London paid out for the losses, and several unalivings have been linked to the case. The Brinksmat robbery happened at 6:40 on the 26th of November 1983, when 6 robbers broke into the Brinksmat warehouse, Unit 7 of the Heathrow International Trading Estate near Heathrow Airport in West London, England. It was described as the crime of the century. The group gained entry to the warehouse from security guard Anthony Black, who was complicit in the robbery. Once inside, they poured petrol over the staff and threatened them with a lit match if they did not reveal the combination numbers to the vault. The robbers thought that they were going to steal around £1 million worth of Spanish pestas, but they also found 3,000 kilograms of pure gold bullion outside the main vault in 152 bars and in 76 cardboard boxes. The gold had been stored at the warehouse overnight before being due to be transferred to Hong Kong the next day. In addition, they stole platinum, 1,000 carats of diamonds, and £250,000 of travellers' cheques. The total value of their haul was £26 million, equivalent to £111 million in 2023. 2 days after the robbery, a couple saw a white-hot crucible operating in the garden hut at a neighbour's property near Bath, Somerset. Suspecting it to be linked to the bullion robbery, they immediately informed the police. The police arrived and they were shown the hut, but they said it was just beyond their jurisdiction and stated that they would pass the information on to the police responsible for that area. The couple were never asked to give a statement to police, nor give evidence in court. No explanation has been given for the police's failure to follow up immediately on the tip-off. Police soon identified that Black's sister was living with Brian Robinson, who appeared in the Flying Squad intelligence files. Black confessed in December 1983 to aiding and abetting the raiders, providing them with impressions of the key to the main door, and giving them details of security measures, and became an informer. He identified his brother-in-law, Brian Robinson, as one of the robbers. 10 days after the robbery, Robinson and Mickey McAvoy were arrested. Anthony Black was also arrested for the robbery but was later acquitted. In January 1985, the premises in Bath were raided and the furnace was found, but the occupier, John Palmer, a jeweller and bullion dealer, was on holiday in Tenerife. His former partners, Garth Chappell and Terence Path, were arrested. The sudden movement of £13 million through the Bristol area branches of Barclays Bank allegedly came to the notice of Bank of England, which informed the police, although the Bank of England denied this. McAvoy had entrusted part of his share to associates Brian Perry and George Francis. Perry recruited Kenneth Noy, who was an expert in this field, to dispose of the gold. Noy melted down the bullion and recast it for sale, mixing in copper coins to disguise the source. Noy was placed under police surveillance. In January 1985, he encountered undercover Detective Constable John Fordham, dressed in camouflage and a balaclava. In the grounds of his home, he stabbed him 10 times, resulting in the detective's death. Noy claimed that he'd been attacked and killed Fordham in self-defence, and at the resulting trial, the jury found him not guilty of murder. Brian Reeder was also at the property at the time and put on trial for murder, but was acquitted. In 1986, 7 men, including Noy, Reeder, Chappell and Patch, were put on trial for handling the stolen gold, with Noy accused of masterminding and controlling the operation to launder the robbery proceeds. Palmer was deported to Britain from Brazil in 1986 and was put on trial in 1987. In court, Palmer said that he was unaware the gold was linked to the robbery and he was cleared of all charges. Another suspect, John Fleming, was held in Miami in 1986 after being deported from Costa Rica, where he had arrived following an earlier ejection from Spain. He was subsequently deported from the US to the UK in 1987 and charged with handling £840,000. Despite a 3-year attempt to question him, his case was thrown out of court after just 25 seconds due to insufficient evidence. In 1988, 9 people, including Perry, solicitor Michael Relton, and McAvoy's wife, Kathleen, were arrested and put on trial for conspiracy to handle stolen goods. Relton was accused of bringing £7.5 million smuggled to Switzerland and Liechtenstein back to the UK to invest in London's property boom in the Docklands. A 10th person, property developer Gordon Parry, was also considered a co-conspirator but initially escaped arrest. The jury failed to reach a verdict for Parry, who faced a retrial. Parry was arrested in Spain in 1989 and returned to the UK a year later and charged with handling over 16 million. He went on trial with, among others, Perry McAvoy's first wife Jacqueline, Patrick Clark and Jean Savage in 1991. Perry was accused of laundering £7.5 million, Clark and his son £4.5 million, and Savage £2.5 million. McAvoy's former wife was alleged to have benefited from a house her ex-husband bought her. The jury failed to reach a verdict for McAvoy, but her house was seized. Anthony Black was sentenced to 6 years for robbery. Mickey McAvoy, Brian Robertson were tried at the Old Bailey in December 1984. McAvoy and Robertson were sentenced to 25 years imprisonment for armed robbery. McAvoy and Robertson were released from prison in 2000. In 1986, Noy was found guilty of conspiracy to handle the Brinksmat gold, fined £500,000 plus £200,000 cost, and sentenced to 14 years in prison. He served 7 years before being released in 1994. Chappell was jailed for 10 years for conspiracy to handle stolen goods and fined £200,000, and Reeder jailed for 8 years. All three men were also convicted of fraudulently conspiring to evade VAT payments. Constantino was convicted of VAT fraud but acquitted of conspiring to handle stolen goods. He was given 12 months suspended jail sentence. In July 1988, Michael Relton was convicted of helping launder proceeds and jailed for 12 years. Kathleen McAvoy was convicted of conspiring to handle stolen goods but given an 18-month suspended jail sentence. In August 1992, Gordon Parry, Brian Perry, Patrick Clark and Jean Savage were convicted at the Old Bailey. Parry was jailed for 10 years, Perry for 9 years, Clark for 6 and Savage for 5 years. A few months after leaving prison in 2001, Perry was shot dead. Attempts by McAvoy to strike a deal to give back his share of the money in exchange for a reduced sentence failed. Since then, the money vanished. Despite a record reward of £2 million offered for locating the gold, much of the 3 tons of stolen gold has never been recovered. £1 million of gold was found stored at the Bank of England. In 1996, about half of the gold, the portion which had been melted and recast, was thought to have found its way back to the legitimate gold market, including the reserves of the true owners, Johnson Matthey. According to the BBC, some have claimed that anyone wearing gold jewellery bought in the UK after 1983 is probably wearing Brinksmat. The rest of the gold was believed to have been buried. Lloyd's of London made a record insurance payout of £26 million. By 1995, 57 people had assets frozen, including homes and a Kansas oil well, and insurers had recovered £16 million, including £3 million from Noy. In January 1995, the High Court ordered McAvoy to make a payment of £27,448,229, making him responsible for the entire sum stolen. Despite being acquitted of robbery, in 1995, White was also ordered by the High Court to repay the stolen £26 million plus £2.2 million in compensation, and his wife ordered to repay £1.1 million. The judge said that he was satisfied that White was involved in planning the robbery. By 2004, £25 million had been recovered in total. On the 21st of December 1983, less than 4 weeks after the robbery, police in Austria arrested 5 men, 4 Italians and an Austrian at a Vienna hotel. Police also recovered 10 billion bars bearing the refiner's mark and the serial numbers of the bars stolen in the Brinksmat robbery. According to the police spokesman, the bars were gold-coated tungsten counterfeits and therefore could not be Johnston Matthey's stolen gold bars. He said that the arrested men planned to fraudulently claim that they were from the Heathrow robbery. No explanation was given as to how the counterfeits obtained the unpublished bar serial numbers, nor the likely benefit of counterfeiting stolen property in this way. On the 30th of September 1984, less than a year after the Brinksmat robbery, the banking and gold trading arm of Johnson Matthey Bankers Limited, collapsed and was taken over by the Bank of England to protect the integrity of the London gold markets. Losses amounted to over $300 million. The bank had made very large loans to fraudsters and insolvent businesses over several years and had serious unexplained gaps in its records. The fraud squad was called in to investigate the bank and certain customers. The so-called Curse of Brinksmat, or Curse of the Brinksmat Millions, refers to the shooting unalivings of several men who were allegedly involved. These unalivings were thought by members of the London criminal underworld to be related to laundering off the gold. In 1990, the former treasurer of the Great Robbery, Charlie Wilson, had moved to Marbella, Spain, where he was suspected of being involved in smuggling. Engaged to launder some of the proceeds from the Brinksmat robbery, he lost the investors $3 million. On the 23rd of April 1990, Wilson was unalived. Nick Whitting, an old school friend of Noy, who was questioned on laundering, was found unalived after being shot twice and stabbed in 1990. John Urquhart was one of the launderers of the proceeds of the robbery. He was unalived in January 1993 on Marylebone High Street in central London. Kenneth Regan assisted police with the information about Urquhart's unaliving. Graham West was subsequently jailed for Urquhart's unaliving, and was his accomplice Geoffrey Heath, who planned the unaliving. In 1996, Keith Headley, a suspected money launderer whose home was searched during the investigation, was unalived on his yacht in the Mediterranean Sea. On the 5th of December 1998, Hatton Garden jeweller Solly Nahome was unalived outside his home. Nahome was a financier and associate of the Adams family, who were also suspected of having been involved in the laundering of Brinksmat gold. Prior to his unaliving, Nahome's associate and jeweller, Gilbert Winter, had disappeared from the home that he shared with his girlfriend on the 9th of March 1998. It was thought that Nahome and Winter were unalived over the disappearance of £800,000 from a deal, while it was suspected that the rival gang unalived Nahome and Winter to cause disruption. In November 2001, Brian Perry was shot 3 times in the head in Deptford. On the 14th of May 2003, George Francis was unalived by John Flynn outside Francis's courier business in Bedminster. Francis was a former associate of the Crays, who were also believed to have been involved in the laundering of the gold. Francis had survived an attempt on his life when he was shot in the shoulder over the bar of the Henry VIII in Hever, which he ran in May 1985. After allegedly failing to pay £100,000 to have a jury acquit Lenny Teddy Bear Watkins, who was on trial for unaliving Peter Bennett, a customs investigator who was shot by Watkins in a struggle. On the 24th of June 2015, John Goldfinger Palmer was shot dead. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum was constructed under the guidance of art collector Isabella Stewart Gardner to house a personal art collection. The museum opened to the public in 1903, and Gardner continued to expand the collection and arrange it until she passed away in 1924. She left the museum with a £3.6 million endowment, and her will stipulated that the arrangement of her artwork should not be altered and that no items were to be sold from or purchased into the collection. By the 1980s, the museum was running low on funds. The financial strain left the museum in poor condition. It lacked a climate control system and an insurance policy, and was in need of basic building maintenance. After the FBI uncovered a plot by Boston criminals to rob the museum in 1982, the museum allocated funds to improve security. Among these improvements were 60 infrared motion detectors and a closed-circuit television system consisting of 4 cameras placed around the building's perimeter. No cameras had been installed inside the museum, as its board of trustees considered the cost prohibitive, but additional security guards were hired. Despite these security improvements, the only manner in which guards could summon police to the museum was by pressing a button at the security desk. Other area museums had fail-safe systems that required night watchmen to place hourly phone calls with the police to indicate that conditions were normal. An independent consultant reviewed the museum's security operations in 1988 and determined that they were on par with most other museums but not recommended improvements. The security director at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston also suggested security upgrades to the museum. Because of the museum's financial strain and Gardner's directive forbidding major renovations, the Board of Trustees did not approve the security enhancements. The board also denied a request from the security director for higher guard salaries in a bid to attract more qualified applicants. The museum guards were paid slightly higher than minimum wage, and the museum's security flaws were an open secret among the guards. The robbery occurred in the early hours of Sunday, the 18th of March 1990. The thieves were first witnessed at around 12:30 a.m. by several St. Patrick's Day revellers leaving a party near the museum. The 2 men were disguised as police officers and parked in a hatchback on Palace Road, about 100 feet from the side entrance. The witnesses believed them to be policemen. The museum guards on duty that night were Rick Abath, aged 23, and Randy Headstand, aged 25. Abath was a regular night watchman, but the 18th of March was Headstand's first time on a night shift. The museum security policy required that one guard would patrol the galleries with a flashlight and walkie-talkie while the other would sit at the security desk. When Abbott took first patrol, fire alarms sounded in several rooms, but he could not locate any fire or smoke. He returned to the security room where the fire alarm control panel indicated smoke in multiple rooms. He assumed that some type of malfunction had occurred and disabled the panel before returning to patrol. Before completing his rounds, Abbott stopped at the side entrance of the museum, briefly opening the side door and shutting it again without informing Headstand. Abbott returned to the security desk around 1 a.m. and Heaston assumed patrol duties. At 1:20 a.m. the thieves drove to the side entrance, parked and walked to the side door. They rang the buzzer which connected them to Abbott through an intercom. They explained to Abbott that they were police investigating a disturbance and that they must be admitted. Abbott could see them on the closed-circuit television wearing what appeared to be police uniforms. He was not aware of any disturbance but surmised that a St. Patrick's Day reveller may have climbed over the fence, causing someone to report it to the police. Abbott admitted the men in at 1:24 a.m. The thieves first entered a locked foyer that separated the side door from the museum. Abbott radioed Hestand to return to the security desk. Abbott noticed around this time that the taller man's moustache appeared to be fake. The shorter man told Abbott that he looked familiar and that they may have a warrant for his arrest, demanding that Abbott emerge from behind the desk to provide identification. Abbott complied, leaving the desk that contained the museum's only panic button to alert police. The shorter man forced Abbott against the wall, spread his legs and handcuffed him. Heaston walked into the room at this time and the taller man turned him towards the wall and handcuffed him. With both guards handcuffed, the thieves revealed their true intentions to rob the museum and asked the guards not to cause any problems. The thieves wrapped duct tape around the heads and eyes of the guards. Without asking for directions, they led the guards into the basement, where the guards were handcuffed to a steam pipe and workbench. The thieves examined the guards' wallets and threatened that they knew where the guards lived and told them that if they did not inform the authorities, they would receive a reward in about a year. It took the thieves less than 15 minutes to subdue the guards, which they completed at about 1:35 a.m. The thieves' movements through the museum were recorded on infrared motion detectors. Steps in the first room they entered, the Dutch room on the second floor, were not recorded until 1:48 a.m. This was 13 minutes after they had finished subduing the guards, perhaps waiting to ensure that police had not been alerted. As the thieves approached the paintings in the Dutch room, a sensor sounded that was intended to alert when patrons moved too close to the artwork, and the thieves smashed the device. They moved the Storm of the Sea of Galilee and A Lady and a Gentleman in Black from the wall and threw them on the marble floor, shattering their glass frames. Using a blade, they cut the canvases out of their stretchers. They also removed a large Rembrandt self-portrait oil painting from the wall but left it leaning against the cabinet. Investigators believe that the thieves may have considered it too large to transport, potentially because it was painted on wood and not canvas like the others. The thieves instead took a small postage stamp-sized self-portrait etching by Rembrandt on display beneath the larger portrait. On the right side of the room, they removed Landscape with Obelisk and The Concert from their frames. The final piece taken from the room was an ancient Chinese gu. At 1:51 a.m, while one thief continued working in the Dutch room, the other entered a narrow hallway dubbed the Short Gallery on the other end of the second floor. They then began removing screws from a frame displaying a Napoleonic flag, likely in an effort to steal the flag. They appeared to have abandoned the effort, as some of the screws were not removed, and they ultimately took only the exposed eagle finial atop the flagpole. They also took 5 Degas sketches from the room. The last work stolen was a chaise Tortoni from the Blue Room on the first floor. The museum's motion detectors did not detect any motion within the Blue Room during the thieves' time in the building. The only footsteps detected in the room that night were Abbot's during the 2 times when he passed through the gallery on his earlier patrol. As they prepared to leave, the thieves checked the guards again and asked if they were comfortable. The thieves then moved to the security director's office, where they took the video cassettes that contained evidence of their entrance from the closed-circuit cameras, as well as the data printouts from the motion detecting equipment. The movement data was also captured on a hard drive, which remained untouched. The frame for chaise Tortoni was left at the security director's desk. The thieves then began to remove the artwork from the museum. The side entrance doors were opened at 2:40 a.m. and again for the last time at 2:45 a.m. The robbery lasted 81 minutes. The next guard shift arrived later in the morning and realised that something was amiss when they could not establish contact with anyone inside for admittance. They called the security director, who entered the building with his keys and found nobody at the watch desk before calling the police. The police searched the building and found the guards still bound in the basement. The FBI took immediate control of the case on the grounds that the artwork could likely cross state lines. Investigators have called the case unique for its lack of strong physical evidence. It is unknown if the thieves left DNA evidence. Although fingerprints and footprints were found at the scene, it could not be concluded whether they were from the thieves or from museum employees. The FBI has performed DNA analysis in the years following the theft as advancements in the field have grown. Some of the evidence has been lost among the agency's files. The guards and witnesses in the street described one thief as being about 5'9" to 5'10" in his late 30s with a medium build. The other as being 6 foot to 6'1" in his early 30s with a heavier build. Security guard Richard Edward Abbott was investigated at an early stage because of his suspicious behaviour on the night of the theft. While on patrol, Abbott briefly opened and closed the side door, a move that some believe could have been a signal to the thieves parked outside. Abbott told authorities that he opened and closed the door routinely to ensure that it was locked. One of Abbott's colleagues told journalists that if Abbott had opened the door routinely as he maintained, supervisors would have noticed him doing so from their computer printout and stopped the behaviour. Suspicion has surrounded the museum's motion detectors, which did not detect any movement in the Blue Room during the time the thieves were in the museum. The only footsteps in the room that night were Abbot's during a security patrol. A security consultant reviewed the motion detector equipment several weeks after the theft and determined that they were operating correctly. In 2015, the FBI released security video from the museum on the night before the theft showing Abbott admitting an unidentified man into the museum to converse at the security desk. Abbott told investigators that he could not recall the incident or recognise the man, and the FBI requested the public's assistance. Several former museum guards came forward and identified the stranger as the museum's deputy security chief. Abbott, who passed away in 2024 at the age of 57, maintained his innocence throughout his life. The FBI agent overseeing the case in its early years concluded that the guards were too incompetent and foolish to have committed the crime. In 1994, the museum director, Anne Hawley, received an anonymous letter from someone who claimed to be attempting to negotiate a return of the artwork. The writer claimed that they were a third-party negotiator and did not know the identity of the thieves. They explained that the artwork was stolen to reduce a prison sentence, but as the opportunity had passed, there was no longer a motive to keep the artwork and they wanted to negotiate a return. The writer explained that the artwork was being held in a non-common law country under climate-controlled conditions. They wanted immunity for themselves and all others involved, and $2.6 million for the return of the artwork, which would be sent to an offshore bank account at the same time the art was handed over. If the museum was interested in negotiating, they should print a coded message in the Boston Globe. To establish credence, the writer conveyed information only known by museum and FBI at the time. Hawley felt this was a strong lead. She contacted the FBI, who then contracted the Globe. The coded message was printed on the 1st of May 1994 edition of the Boston Globe. Hawley received a second letter a few days later in which the writer acknowledged the museum was interested in negotiating, but that they had become fearful of what they perceived was a massive investigation by federal and state authorities to determine their identity. The writer explained that they needed time to evaluate their options, but Hawley never heard from the writer again. Brian McDevitt was a con man from Boston who tried to rob the Hyde Collection in Glens Falls, New York in 1981. He dressed up as a FedEx driver, carried handcuffs and duct tape, and planned to steal a Rembrandt. He was also known as a flag aficionado and fits the description of the larger robber except for his thinning red hair. These parallels to the Gardner case fascinated the FBI, so they interviewed him in late 1990. McDevitt denied any involvement and refused to take a polygraph test. The FBI ran his fingerprints, which did not match any of those at the crime scene. McDevitt later moved to California and made his way into television and film writing. He passed away in 2004. The FBI announced significant progress in the investigation in March 2013. They reported with a high degree of confidence that they identified the thieves, which they believed were members of a criminal organisation based in the Mid-Atlantic and New England. They also felt, with the same confidence, that the artwork was transported to Connecticut and Philadelphia in the years following the theft, with an attempted sale in Philadelphia in 2002. Their knowledge of what happened after this is limited, and they requested the public's help to locate and return the artwork. In 2015, the FBI stated both thieves were deceased. Though the FBI did not publicly identify any individual, sources familiar with the investigation said they were associated with a gang from Dorchester. The gang was loyal to Boston Mafia boss Frank Salem and ran their operations out of an automobile repair shop run by criminal Carmelo Merlino. Merlino's associates may have gained knowledge of the museum's weaknesses after gangster Louis Royce cased it in early 1981. He devised plans with an associate to light up smoke bombs and rush the galleries amidst the confusion. In 1982, when an undercover FBI agents were investigating Royce and his associates for an unrelated art theft, they learned of their interest in robbing the Gardner Museum and warned the museum of the gang's plan. Royce was in prison at the time of the robbery. Royce shared his plan with others and believes associate Stephen Rossetti may have ordered the robbery or shared it with someone else. Among those associated with the Merlino gang were Robert Guarente and Manchester, Connecticut gangster Robert Janelle. Guarente passed away from cancer in 2004, but his widow, Aline, told FBI in 2010 that her husband had previously owned some of the paintings. She claimed that when her husband got sick with cancer in the early 2000s, he gave his paintings to Janelle for safekeeping. Gentile denied the accusations, claiming that he was never given them and knew nothing about their whereabouts. Federal authorities indicted Janelle on drug charges in 2012, likely in an attempt to pressure Janelle for information about the Gardner works. He submitted to a polygraph test, which indicated that he was lying when he denied any knowledge of the theft or location of the artwork. Gentile maintained that he was telling the truth and demanded a retest. During the retest, he said Aline had once shown him a missing Rembrandt self-portrait, which the polygraph machine indicated that he was telling the truth. Gentile's lawyer felt that the veracity of Gentile's claims were being affected by the large presence of federal agents and requested a smaller meeting in hopes that it would get Gentile to speak honestly. In the more intimate meeting, Gentile maintained that he did not have any information. A few days later, the FBI stormed Gentile's house in Manchester with a search warrant. The FBI found a secret ditch beneath a false door in the backyard shed, but found it empty. Gentile's son explained that the ditch flooded a few years prior and that his father was upset about whatever was stored there. In the basement, they found a copy of the Boston Herald from March 1990 reporting the theft, along with a piece of paper indicating what each price might sell on the black market. Beyond this, no conclusive evidence was found to indicate that he'd ever had the paintings. Gentile went to prison for 30 months on drug charges. If he knew the information about the theft, at no point did he opt to share it, which would have reduced his sentence or freed him from prison. After getting out of prison, he spoke with an investigative reporter, Stephen Kurjan, claiming that he was framed by the FBI. He also explained how the imprisonment was detrimental to his finances and personal life. He also explained that the list found in the basement was written up by a criminal trying to broker the return of the works from Guarente and was talking to Gentile as an intermediary. When asked about what could have been in the ditch, Gentile could not recall but believed it could have been small motors. David Turner was another associate of Merlino. The FBI began investigating him in 1992 when a source told them that Turner had access to the paintings. Merlino was arrested that same year for drug trafficking and told authorities that he could return the paintings for a reduced prison sentence. He asked Turner to track down the paintings. Turner failed to return them, though he heard they were in a church in South Boston. Another associate arrested in the drug sting told authorities about Turner's involvement in several break-ins but never mentioned the Gardner heist. Based on conversations with Merlino after his release from prison in mid-1990s, authorities gathered that Merlino never had direct access to the paintings but could possibly broker for their return. Despite his claims for innocence, the FBI believes that he may have been one of the thieves. Evidence indicates that he went to Florida to pick up a drug order just days before the heist, and credit card records believe that he remained there through the night of the robbery. But investigators believe that this may have been Turner's attempt at creating an alibi. The FBI thinks that the other thief was his friend and Merlino associate, George Rasfielder. He passed away in July 1991. No clues were found in his apartment or the homes of friends and relatives, but his siblings recall a similar painting to Chez Tortini in his bedroom. Investigators believe that he looks similar to the summer man in the police sketches. In 1999, the FBI arrested Turner, Molino, Rossetti, and others in a sting operation the day they planned to rob a Loomis Fargo vault. When the FBI brought Turner in for questioning, they told him that they had information that he participated in the Gardner robbery, and that if he returned the paintings, they would let him go. He told authorities that he did not know who stole the paintings, nor where they could be hidden. In his 2001 trial, he claimed entrapment that the FBI let the Loomis Fargo plot proceed so they could pressure him for information about the Gardner paintings. The jury found him guilty and he was sent to prison. Turner knew Gentile through Guarente. In 2010, he wrote a letter to Gentile asking if he could call Turner's former girlfriend to assist in recovering the Gardner paintings. In cooperation with the FBI, Gentile spoke with Turner's girlfriend, and she told him that Turner wanted him to speak with two of his ex-convict friends in Boston. The FBI wanted Gentile to meet the men and send the FBI undercover agent with him, but Gentile did not want to cooperate further. Turner was freed in November 2019, 1 month after Rossetti. Molino passed away in prison in 2005. Criminal Bobby Donati was murdered in 1991 in the midst of a gang war within the Patricia crime family. His involvement in the Gardner theft was suspected after a notorious New England art thief, Miles J. Connor Jr., spoke with authorities. Connor was in jail at the time of the heist, but believed Donati and criminal David Horton were the masterminds. Connor had worked with Donati in the past at heist and claimed the two cased the Gardner Museum where Donati took interest. Connor also claimed that Horton visited him in jail after the heist and said that he and Donati organised it and that they were going to use the paintings to get Connor out of jail. If this is true, they likely borrowed the idea from Connor as he returned to reduce sentences in the past. Even though Donati's and Horton's appearances did not fit the witnesses' descriptions, Connor suggests that they probably hired lower-level gangsters to carry out the robbery. Like Donati, Horton also passed away within 2 years of the robbery, though from an illness rather than murder. Connor told investigators that he could assist in the returning of the Gardner works in exchange for the museum's posted reward and his freedom. When investigators did not give in to Connor's demands because of a lack of evidence, he suggested that they speak with criminal and antiques dealer William P. Youngsworth. Acting on Connor's lead, the FBI opened a case on Youngsworth and conducted raids on his home and antique store properties in the 1990s. The raids caught the attention of journalist Tom Mashberg, who began talking with Youngsworth in 1997 about the theft. One night in August 1997, Youngsworth called Mashberg and told him that he had proof that he could return the Gardner paintings under the right conditions. That night, Youngsworth picked up Mashberg from the Boston Herald offices and drove him to a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Youngsworth led him inside a storage unit with several large cylinder tubes. He removed one painting from its tube, unfurled it, and showed it to Mashberg under flashlight. It appeared to Mashberg to be the Storm of the Sea of Galilee. He noticed cracking along the canvas, and the edges were cut in a manner consistent with the museum's reports. And he noted Rembrandt's signature on the ship's rudder. Mashberg wrote of his experience in the Boston Herald, leaving out details to hide Youngsworth's identity and the painting's location. He reported that his informant told him the robbery was pulled off by 5 men identified too. Donati was one of the robbers, and Horton was responsible for moving the art to a safe house. The FBI discovered the location of the warehouse several months later and raided it, finding nothing. The veracity of Youngsworth's claims and the authenticity of the painting shown to Mashberg is disputed. Youngsworth supplied paint chips to Mashberg, and federal authorities reported that they were indeed from Rembrandt's era but did not match oils used for the Storm on the Sea of the Galilee. The way Mashberg described the painting as being unfurled has also been scrutinised, as the stolen painting was covered with a heavy varnish that could not roll easily. Federal authorities and the museum began working with Youngsworth after Mashberg's story was published, but Youngsworth made negotiations difficult. He would not work with authorities unless his demands could be met, which included full immunity and Connor's release from jail. The authorities were sceptical of Youngsworth's veracity and only offered partial immunity. The United States Attorney overseeing the case eventually ceased talks with Youngsworth, unless he could provide more reliable evidence that he had access to the Gardner works. Youngsworth again provided a vial of paint chips, purportedly from the storm on the Sea of Galilee, and 25 colour photographs of the painting and a lady and gentleman in black. A joint statement from the museum and federal investigators announced that the chips were not from the stolen Rembrandts, though they did test as being from the 17th century paintings that could potentially be from the concert. In 2014, investigative reporter Stephen Kurgan wrote to gangster Vincent Ferreira, Donati's superior during the gang war, inquiring that he had information about the Gardner theft. He received a call back from an associate of Ferreira who explained that the FBI was wrong in suspecting the Molinos gang involvement and claimed that Donati organised the robbery. The caller explained that Donati visited Ferreira in jail about 3 months before the theft, after the latter was charged with murder, and told Ferreira that he was going to do something to get him out of jail. 3 months later, Ferreira heard news about the Gardner theft, after which Donati visited him again and confirmed to Ferreira that he was involved in the robbery. He claimed to have buried the artwork and would start a negotiation for his release once the investigation cooled down. The negotiations never occurred because Donati was murdered. Kurgan believes Donati was motivated to free Ferreira from prison because Ferreira could protect him in a gang war. A friend of Guarente also corroborated that Donati organised the robbery and that Donati gave paintings to Guarente when he became concerned of his own safety. Donati was close friends with Guarente. The two were seen at a social club in Revere shortly before the robbery with a bag of police uniforms. Patricia Campbell Hearst is the member of the Hearst family and granddaughter of American publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst and philanthropist Phoebe Hearst. She first became known for the events following her 1974 kidnapping by the Symbionese Liberation Army. She was found and arrested 19 months after being abducted, by which time she was a fugitive wanted for serious crimes committed with members of the group. She was held in custody, and there was speculation before trial that her family's resources would enable her to avoid time in prison. At her trial, the prosecution suggested that Hearst had joined the Symbionese Liberation Army of her own volition. However, she testified that she had been R-worded and threatened with unaliving while held captive. In 1974, she was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 35 years in prison, later reduced to 7 years. Her sentence was commuted by President Jimmy Carter, and she was later pardoned by President Bill Clinton. Hearst, who prefers to be called Patricia, was born on the 20th of February 1954 in San Francisco, California, the third of 5 daughters of Randolph Apperson Hearst and Catherine Wood Campbell. She was raised primarily in Hillsborough and attended the private Crystal Springs School for Girls there, Sacred Heart in Atherton, and the Santa Catalina School in Monterey. She attended Menlo College in Atherton, California before transferring to the University of California, Berkeley. The family wielded immense political influence and had opposed organised labour, gold mine workers' rights and communism before World War II. Hearst's father was among the member of the heirs to the family fortune that did not control the Hearsts' interests. Her family had not considered it necessary to take preventative measures to ensure their children's personal security. At the time of her abduction, Hearst was a sophomore at Berkeley studying art history. She lived with her fiancé, Stephen Weed, in an apartment in Berkeley. On the 4th of February 1974, 19-year-old Hearst was kidnapped from a Berkeley apartment. A small urban guerrilla left-wing group called the Symbionese Liberation Army claimed responsibility for the abduction. Hearst's kidnapping was partly opportunistic, as she resided near the SLA hideout. According to testimony at trial, the group's main intention was to leverage the Hearst family's political influence to free an SLA members, Russ Little and Joe Romino, who had been arrested for the November 1973 unaliving of Marcus Foster, superintendent of Oakland Public Schools. After the state refused to free them, the SLA demanded that Hearst family distribute $70 worth of food to every needy Californian, an operation that would cost an estimated $400 million. In response, Hearst's father obtained a loan and arranged the immediate donation of $2 million worth of food for the poor of the Bay Area for 1 year in a project called People in Need. After the distribution descended into chaos, the SLA refused to release Hearst. According to Hearst's testimony at a 1976 trial, she was held for a week in a closet, blindfolded, with her hands tied. During this time, SLA founder Clinique Donald DeFries repeatedly threatened her with unaliving. She was allowed to leave the closet for meals, still blindfolded, and began to participate in the group's political discussions. She was given a flashlight for reading and SLA political tracts to memorise. Hearst was confined in the closet for weeks. She said, in an April 1974 account, Hearst claimed that she had been offered the choice of being released or joining the SLA. When asked for a decision, Hearst elected to remain and fight with the SLA. The blindfold was removed, allowing her to see her captors for the first time. After this, she was given daily lessons on her duties, especially weapon drills. Angela Atwood told Hearst that the others wanted Hearst to share in the actual freedom among the unit. Hearst later claimed to have been outworded by William Willie Wolfe and DeFreeze. On the 3rd of April 1974, 2 months after she'd been abducted, Hearst announced to an audio tape released to the media that she joined the SLA and adopted the name Tanya, a tribute to Che Guevara's comrade Heidi Tamara Burke Bider. On the 15th of April 1974, Hearst was recorded on surveillance video wielding an M1 carbine while robbing the Sunset District branch of the Hibernia Bank at 1450 Noriega Street in San Francisco. Hearst, identified under the pseudonym of Tanya, yelled. 2 men entered the bank while the robbery was occurring and shot and wounded by the SLA. According to testimony at her trial, a witness thought that Hearst had been several paces behind the others when running to the getaway car. Attorney General William B. Saxby said that Hearst was a common criminal and not a reluctant participant in the bank robbery. James L. Browning Jr. said that her participation in the robbery may have been voluntary, contrasting with an earlier comment in which he said that she might have been coerced into taking part. The FBI agent heading the investigation said that the SLA members were photographed pointing guns at Hearst during the robbery. On the 16th of May 1974, the manager at Mel's Sporting Goods in Inglewood, California, observed a minor theft by William Harris, who had been shopping with his wife, Emily, while Hearst waited across the road in a van. The manager and an employee followed Harris out and confronted him. There was a scuffle and the manager restrained Harris when a pistol fell out of Harris's waistband. Hearst discharged the entire magazine of an automatic carbine into the overhead storefront, causing the manager to dive behind a light post. He tried to shoot back, but Hearst began aiming closer. Hearst and the Harris couple hijacked 2 cars and abducted the owners. One was a young man who found Hearst so pleasant that he was reluctant to report the incident. He testified at trial that heard discussing the effectiveness of cyanide-tipped bullets and repeatedly asking him if he was okay. Police had surrounded the main base of the SLA in Los Angeles before these 3 returned, so they hid elsewhere. The 6 SLA members inside the hideout died. There was an hour-long gunfight with police and 2 members were fatally shot. A fire broke out in the house in which the remainder died, but DeFreeze first killed himself by gunshot. It was initially thought that Hearst had died during this confrontation. Warrants were issued for the arrest of Hearst and Harris's for several felonies, including 2 counts of kidnapping. Emily Harris went to a Berkeley rally to commemorate the deaths of Angela Atwood, Solist, and DeFreeze, the other founding members of the SLA who had died in Los Angeles during the police siege. Harris recognised Atwood's acquaintance Kathy Celaya among the radicals who she had known from the civil rights groups. Celaya introduced the 3 fugitives to Jack Scott, an athletics reformer and radical, and he agreed to provide them with help and money. Hearst helped make improvised explosive devices. These were used in 2 unsuccessful attempts to unalive police officers during August 1975. One of the devices failed to detonate. Marked money found in the apartment where she was arrested linked Hearst to the SLA armed robbery of Crocker National Bank in Carmichael, California. She was the getaway car driver for the robbery. Myrna Usapil, a mother of 4 who was at the bank making a deposit, was shot dead by a masked Emily Harris. Hearst was potentially at risk for felony murder charges and could testify as a witness against Harris for a capital offence. On the 18th of September 1975, Hearst was arrested in San Francisco apartment with Wendy Yoshimura, another SLA member, by San Francisco Police Inspector Timothy F. Casey and his partner, Police Officer Lawrence R. Pesaro, and FBI Special Agent Thomas J. Padden and his partners, FBI agents Jason Moultron, Frank Doyle Jr., Larry Lawler, Monte Hall, Dick Vitamonte, Leo Brassinison, and Ray Campos. While being booked into jail, Hearst listed her occupation as urban guerrilla. She asked her attorney to relay the following message. At the time of her arrest, Hearst's weight had dropped to 40 kilograms, and she was described by psychologist Margaret Singer in October 1975 as low IQ effect zombie. Shortly after her arrest, doctors recorded signs of trauma. Her IQ was measured as 112. whereas it had previously been 130. There were huge gaps in her memory regarding her pre-Tanya life. She was smoking heavily and had nightmares. Without a mental illness or defect, a person is considered to be fully responsible for any criminal action done under duress, which is defined as a clear and present threat of death or serious injury. For Hearst to secure an acquittal on the grounds of having been brainwashed would have been completely unprecedented. Psychiatrist Louis Joylan West, a professor at University of California, was appointed by the court in his capacity as a brainwashing expert and worked without a fee. After the trial, he wrote a newspaper article asking President Carter to release Hearst from prison. Hearst wrote in her memoir, Every Secret Thing, 1982, after some weeks in custody, Hearst repudiated her SLA allegiance. Her first lawyer, Terence Hallen, had advised Hearst not to talk to anyone, including psychiatrists. He advocated a judgment of involuntary intoxication that the SLA had given her drugs that affected her judgment and recollection. He was replaced by attorney F. Lee Bailey, who asserted a defence of coercion or duress affecting intent at the time of the offence. This was similar to the brainwashing defence that Hanlon had warned was not a defence in law. Hearst gave long interviews to various psychiatrists. Hearst was arraigned for the Hibernia Bank robbery. The trial commenced on the 15th of January 1976. Judge Oliver Jesse Carter ruled that Hearst's taped and written statements after the bank robbery while she was a fugitive with the SLA members were voluntary. He did not allow expert testimony that stylistic analysis indicated that the Tanya statements and writing were not wholly composed by Hearst. He permitted the prosecution to introduce statements and actions Hearst made long after the Hibernia robbery as evidence of a state of mind at the time of the robbery. Judge Carter also allowed into evidence a recording made by jail authorities of a friend jail visit with Hearst, in which Hearst used profanities and spoke of her radical and feminist beliefs, but he did not allow tapes of psychiatrist Louis Joylan West's interviews of Hearst to be heard by the jury. Judge Carter was described as resting his eyes during testimony favourable to the defence by West and others. According to Hearst's testimony, her captors had demanded she appear enthusiastic during the robbery and warned that she would pay with her life for any mistake. Her defence lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, provided photographs showing that SLA members, including Camilla Hall, had pointed guns at Hearst during the robbery. In reference to the shooting at Mel's Sporting Goods store and her decision not to escape, Hearst testified that she was instructed throughout her captivity on what to do in emergencies. She said one class in particular had a situation similar to the store manager's detention of the Harrises. Hearst testified that, testifying for prosecution, Dr. Harry Kozol said Hearst had been a rebel in search of a cause and her participation in the Hibernia robbery had been an act of free will. Prosecutor James L. Browning Jr. asked other psychiatrists testing for the prosecution, Dr. Joel Fort, if Hearst was in fear of death or great bodily injury during the robbery, to which he answered, no. Bailey angrily objected. Fort assessed Hearst as amoral and said that she had voluntarily had sex with Wolf de Vries, which Hearst denied both in court and outside. Prosecutor Browning tried to show that writings by Hearst indicated her testimony had been misinterpreted her actions with Wolf. She said that she'd been writing the SLA version of events and that she'd been punched in the face by William Harris when she refused to be more effusive about what she regarded as SA by Wolf. Judge Carter allowed testimony from the prosecution's psychiatrist about Hearst's early actual experiences, although these had occurred years before her kidnapping and the bank robbery. In court, Hearst made a poor impression and appeared lethargic. An Associated Press report attributed this state to drugs she was given by jail doctors. Bailey was strongly criticised for his decision to put Hearst on the stand, then having her repeatedly decline to answer questions. According to Alan Dershowitz, Bailey was wrong-footed by the judge, who had appeared to indicate she would have Fifth Amendment privilege. The jury would not be present for some of her testimony, or would be instructed not to draw interferences on matters subsequent to the Hibernia Bank charges for which she was being tried, but he changed his mind. After a few months, Hearst provided information to the authorities, not under oath. Sworn testimony would have been used to convict her of SLA activities. A bomb exploded at Hearst Castle in February 1976. After Hearst testified that Wolf had essayed her, Emily Harris gave a magazine interview from jail alleging that Hearst keeping the trinket given to her by Wolfe was an indication that she had been in a romantic relationship with him. Hearst said that she had kept the stone carving because she thought it was a pre-Columbian artifact of archaeological significance. The prosecutor, James L. Browning Jr., used Harris's interpretation of the item. Some jurors later said that they regarded the carving which Browning waved in front of them as powerful evidence that Hearst was lying. In his closing argument, Prosecutor Browning suggested that Hearst had taken part in the bank robbery without coercion. Browning, who later became a judge, also suggested to the jury that, as the female SLA members were feminists, they would not have allowed Hearst to be R-worded. In her autobiography, Hearst expressed disappointment with what she saw as Bailey's lack of focus in the crucial end stage of her trial. She described him as having the appearance of someone with a hangover and spilling water down the front of his pants while making a disjointed closing argument. Bailey's final statement to the court was, on the 20th of March 1976, Hearst was convicted of bank robbery and using a firearm during the commission of a felony. She was given the maximum sentence possible of 35 years imprisonment, pending a rejection at the final sentence hearing, which Carter declined to specify. Because Judge Carter had died, Judge William H. Orrick Jr. determined Hearst's sentence. He gave her 7 years imprisonment, commenting that rebellious young people who, for whatever reason, become revolutionaries and voluntarily commit criminal acts will be punished. Hearst was imprisoned at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. She suffered a collapsed lung in prison, the beginning of a series of medical problems, and she underwent emergency surgery. This prevented her from appearing to testify against the Harrises on 11 charges, including robbery, kidnapping and assault. She was also arraigned for those charges. She was held in solitary confinement for security reasons. She was granted bail for an appeal hearing in November 1976 on the condition that she was protected on bond. Her father hired dozens of bodyguards. Superior Court Judge Talbot Callister gave her probation on the sporting goods store charge when she pleaded no contest, saying that he believed that she had been subject to coercion amounting to torture. California Attorney General Avell J. Younger said that, if there was a double standard for the wealthy, it was the opposite of what was genuinely believed, and that Hearst had received a stiffer sentence than a person of lesser means might have. He stated that she had no legal brainwashing defence, but pointed out that the events had started with her kidnapping. Hearst's bail was revoked on May 1978 when appeals failed and the Supreme Court declined to hear her case. The prison took new special security measures for her safety until she found a dead rat on her bunk on the day when William and Emily Harris were arraigned for her abduction. The Harrises were convicted on a simple kidnapping charge, and they were released after serving a total of 8 years each. Representative Leo Ryan was collecting signatures on a petition for Hearst's release several weeks before being murdered while visiting the Jonestown settlement in Guyana. Actor John Wayne spoke after the Jonestown cult deaths, stating that people had accepted that Jim Jones had brainwashed 900 individuals into mass suicide, but could not accept that the Symbionese Liberation Army could have brainwashed a kidnapped teenage girl. President Jimmy Carter commuted Hearst's federal sentence to the 22 months served, freeing her 8 months before she was liable for her first parole hearing. Her release on the 1st of February 1979 was under stringent conditions, and she remained on probation for the state sentence with a sporting goods store plea. She recovered full civil rights when President Bill Clinton granted her a pardon on the 20th of January 2001, his last day in office. 2 months after her release from prison, Hearst married Bernard Lee Shaw, born in 1945, a policeman who was part of her security detail during her time on bail. They had 2 children, Gillian and Lydia Hearst Shaw, and her husband passed away in 2013. Hearst became involved in a foundation helping children with AIDS and was active in other charities and fundraising activities.